So primer revealed the flaws. We're going to take care of those now with some filling. There are several kinds of filler that you can use, and we're going to show a couple of those today. For small gaps, I like super glue. It flows nicely into those and is easy to use. For larger gaps, there's traditional model putties. There's a couple different kinds of those, which we'll talk about. And then for really large gaps and for building up contours, there's two-part epoxy putty. We're not going to talk about that today, but I thought I'd show it just as a contrast. So this is the whippet that we primed last time. It's looking pretty good, but there's a couple of small gaps I'd like to take care of with super glue. So we'll start that now. So we'll start by dispensing a little super glue onto this container. It's just a disposable container that I use. It's got a nice helpful little divot in the middle, which works as a receptacle. Before you start using super glue, you should know there are several different consistencies of super glue. There's thin, medium consistency, and thick or gel super glue. They're useful for different kinds of things. For filling gaps, I prefer the sort of medium consistency because it runs fairly well without running everywhere and getting into places like your hands and sticking to the model. So I like to use a toothpick as an applicator. Just dip it in and pick up a little glue on the tip. And then you can just transfer it to the gap with the toothpick and run it along, and it should just fill that up nicely. You can speed the process by using a little accelerator or zip kicker. I like to use one of these disposable micro brushes, pick up a little on it. Don't touch it directly to where the glue was, but let it run into the gap from the sides or the top. Now in this case, because the gap is in a corner, I don't really need to sand it. If you do need to sand super glue, do it as quickly as possible after it has started to set. You don't want it to set rock hard because it can be harder than the surrounding plastic, and if you have to over sand it, you can damage the plastic on either side of the gap rather than sanding the super glue. It's still possible to sand it when it's hard, it just takes more care. So this is the propane tank that we also primed in the last episode. You can see that this revealed some pretty serious gaps between the end caps and the body, and a couple of sprue attachment knobs that are going to need to be taken off. So I'm going to start by sanding. And since this is pretty serious work, I'm going to start with a coarse sanding stick. Because of the differences in the materials here, it's going to be hard for me to level this out completely. So my goal is really just to take care of minor inconsistencies like these knobs and give it a little bit more surface for the putty to attach to. So this is looking a lot better than it did. I've sanded these relatively smooth. You can tell there's still a little bit of a gap there, but I'm going to take care of that with the filler putty. So first things first, this stuff can be a little toxic, so I'm going to put on some gloves. So there are two kinds of model putty. There's traditional solvent-based, and then there are the newer water-based putties. For the large gaps on this, I'm going to use traditional model putty. In this case, I'm going to be using the Tamiya putty. Solvent-based putties can separate a little in the tube if they've been sitting for a while, so it's a good idea to kind of give it a good massage and mix it around a little bit. It's kind of like a metal toothpaste tube. Once you've got it mixed up, squeeze out some onto a disposable palette. And then I'm going to use a wooden stick to pick up a little and then apply it liberally to the gap. With this kind of putty, you want to apply a little bit more than you really need because it shrinks as it dries. I'm also aware now of one of the other disadvantages of using this kind of putty, and that is that it's pretty smelly. Has a distinctive odor. You want to use it in a ventilated space away from naked flames. While we're at it, there's a couple of small holes at the very ends of the tank, which I'm going to fill with the other kind of putty that we use, which is the water-based stuff. So for this, I'm going to use Deluxe Materials Perfect Plastic Putty. It has a consistently sort of like toothpaste, so I'm going to squeeze a little out onto the same palette. And again, using a wooden spatula or stir stick. And in this case, I'm going to put some on. The nice thing about this stuff is, number one, it doesn't smell nearly as bad. And the other thing is, it doesn't shrink as it dries. So you can get much closer to the amount that you need to fill the gap. So we're back. We let this set for a couple of days by design and then a couple more days because we got busy. So the putty is nice and hard. I'm going to get ready and sand it out. Coarse sanding stick. So you just want to sand across the seam. You don't want to sand with the seam because this will smooth it out and blend it. If you sand with the seam, you risk putting a step in it. check your work every so often. You can see there that I'm getting the white plastic from the one side and the black or clear plastic on the other side, and the filler in between. You'll notice that the sanding stick is filling up with putty dust. That'll interfere with its ability to sand or abrade the putty, but there's a quick way you can clear that, and that's by flicking it against the edge of your workbench. And you'll notice that it's pretty clear now after flicking it against the side. It does a good job of clearing that out. So you want to do that periodically so it doesn't become too compacted in there. And then it's just back to sanding. Once you're done with the coarse stick, you're going to want to smooth out the rough patches. So I'm going to go over it with progressively finer sanding sticks. You don't have to put quite as much English on it this time. Really, all you're trying to do is smooth out the damage you did earlier. Now that we have the larger gaps pretty well taken care of, we need to deal with the small end points, which we filled with the Deluxe Materials Perfect Plastic Putty. It's a lot easier to sand. This is a very curved surface, so I'm going to flex the stick slightly and just go rock it back and forth. You don't have to press very hard on this stuff, and Bob's your uncle. You have a nice little dot of putty in the spot. Now I'm ready to reprime this, except I need to clean all of the dust from sanding off the surface. You can wash that, but I prefer to use a tack cloth, which is just a cloth impregnated with a sticky substance. It's used by painters to do just this, and that's remove dust. All you need to do is rub it lightly over the surface, and it will pick up all of the light dust and debris. So the tank's ready to go, so maybe it's time to do some airbrushing on Airbrushing with Aaron. I'm going to go ahead and reprime the tank, and we'll check our work. Just like with any airbrushing, I'm going to build this up slowly on the area that I sanded so heavily. So light coats at first, heavier as we go. So this is it primed, and it actually looks pretty good. At this end, I can see a little bit of still a little bit of the lip in the shadowing here. Nothing a little bit more sanding and repriming won't take care of. So to recap, I've shown you a couple of easy methods for filling gaps on your models, both with super glue and with filler putty. As you can see, the whippet's back, and while the putty was drying on this, I took the time to add some post shading to this, which we'll get into in another episode.
From here, I can't tell. So.
It was mostly white, so
Okay.
it's not like I had a big salad or something. Bunch of chives. Look, we finally get to airbrush something on Airbrushing with Aaron. So here we are, tank ready to go. Got Vallejo gray primer in a brush that doesn't want to spray. Hang on a second.